Croc, Legend of the Gobbos, has always intrigued me. I never owned it as a kid. The closest I got was playing it at a local youth centre called Fun Station, although local feral kids had pulled the buttons out of the PS1 and N64 controllers, limiting the playability of anything there. So, besides from that sad experience, today I'm finally giving it a chance. And giving it a chance is the key phrase here. When you think of heavyweights in PlayStation platforming, you'll likely think of Crash Bandicoot, which released late 1996, and Spyro the Dragon, which hit the shelves late 1998. Croc, on the other hand, released smack bang in the middle of those two, seeing daylight in late 1997. It can be difficult to not draw comparisons between the three, and it was such an early platforming release on a system known for a healthy list of the genre by the time it was discontinued. Spyro and Crash get a lot of airtime in the present, however, both seeing remasters in recent years. So I'm on a quest to see why nobody ever talks about Croc anymore.
The research started well. The developer was Argonaut Software. They were known for a host of classic games, but their crowning achievement was instead hardware in the form of the Super Effects chip. Yes, 3D games on the SNES, including the likes of Star Fox, Vortex, and Stunt Race FX. It's a topic I love to discuss on this channel, so the research eagerly continued. As it turns out, that very chip is the origin story for Croc existing in the first place. While Argonaut was still chummy with Nintendo in 1994, they created a demo of a racing game with the Super Effects chip that featured Yoshi. While Nintendo was initially interested in the project, they ultimately rejected the idea. The genuine reason for this is unknown, but the N64 was right around the corner with 3D from the get-go. Coupled with Nintendo also cancelling Star Fox 2 in 1995, which was nearly finished, the relationship between the two eroded and Argonaut started shopping around for alternative publishers. They eventually struck a deal with Fox Interactive, and Yoshi the dinosaur evolved into a crocodile, which is essentially a modern day dinosaur anyway. Sadly, the original Yoshi prototype has never surfaced, except for several assets. However, I should add that these were discovered in the infamous 2020 Giga leak. It might just be assumed that the assets belong to Yoshi Racing, I'm not sure. Regardless, it would make for an awesome episode of Unreleased or Unobtainable if a prototype ever did surface. Back to Yoshi. Let's begin with the plot. In the Gobbo Valley, you'll find a race of small, furry, and identical looking critters called Gobbos. They are led by King Rufus, who wears a crown to discern his very important role. One day, a basket floats down the river with a baby croc inside. According to Google, baby crocodiles are referred to as hatchlings. Cute. King Rufus and the Gobbos raise Croc like their own, even when he grows to his full size. All is fine in the Gobbo Valley, until eventually, an evil magician called Baron Dante invades the valley with his group of henchmen. They capture the Gobbos, including the king, and lock them in cages. This is not before the king summons a magical bird called Beanie, however, who whisks Croc to safety. As you can imagine, the goal of the game is to rescue the Gobbos and, of course, reinstate the monarchy. This is only shown in a short cutscene with no dialogue, so you'll need to read the manual for a more detailed account. According to lead designer Nick Cusworth in a Retro Gamer magazine interview, Fox paid a Simpsons writer a large sum of money to fill in the story's gaps. The manual is a bit of a wild ride, including such gems as...
At the start of each year, the Gobbo's High Priestess would announce the kitchen utensil that, when put down their pants, would bring good luck. Gobbos took this very seriously, although some began to question the practice during the year of the electric can opener.
And...
people far and wide had heard of King Rufus the Intolerant and feared him for his name alone. Of course, the Gobbos knew his full name was King Rufus the Lactose Intolerant, and therefore only feared him after a big bowl of cottage cheese.
An early 3D platformer has entered the chat, and the first point of discussion needs to be the controls. So, referring back to its release, sandwiched between Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, you may know that the later release Spyro has analog controls, while the earlier Crash doesn't. Croc technically does, but its awkward 1997 release means it's a bit of a special case. Croc has both password saves and memory card support, for instance. According to that same Retro Gamer magazine interview, Cusworth stated that the DualShock's predecessor, the Dual Analog Controller, was released by Sony several weeks before Croc's printing date. Because of that, digital tank controls were shoehorned to work with the sticks at the very last minute. They didn't do too bad a job considering, but movement is very sensitive. The ice levels are unplayable at some points, and it's all too easy to walk off small platforms when you're just trying to adjust yourself for a jump. Thankfully, there is a dedicated button to turn 180 degrees on the spot, which takes a lot of frustration out of certain scenarios. Otherwise, Croc is quite responsive when it comes to aspects like attacks. As long as you go into this game expecting tank controls, Croc is very playable. Speaking of attacks, Croc can defend himself and save the Gobbo race by whipping his tail or stomping on an aggressor's head. You can also stomp on boxes to find loot, and sometimes Gobbos. The nature of the level design means that you'll likely be backtracking often, and annoyingly, enemies will respawn after about 10 seconds. This certainly puts on the heat if they're intertwined among difficult platforming sections. As you progress, you'll discover white crystals, which are usually found in the crates you stomp on. Collect 100 of these, and you'll earn a life. But if you sustain an injury, you will drop every crystal you've collected. And then, Sonic the Hedgehog style, you'll have a limited chance to recollect these scattered crystals before they disappear. Just like in Sonic, if you get attacked and have 0 crystals, you'll lose a life and have to start again from a checkpoint. Thankfully, the checkpoint system is fairly reasonable, but if you get stuck in a section where you don't even have 1 crystal to your name, it can be all too easy to piss away your saved up lives. Lives can be collected individually, but they're not very common, meaning I spent most of the time on the default 3 lives a game gives you when you completely run out. There are simply not enough crystals to collect to gain lives in any reasonable manner. The game is based across the Gobbo archipelago, which is split between 4 islands. Each island has a theme. For example, one is a frozen, slippery wasteland, while another is based in the desert. This is notable since gameplay mechanics can change depending on the environment. There are 6 levels to an island, with 6 Gobbos to find in each. It's not compulsory to find them all, but if you do, secret levels will be unlocked. If you then complete all the secret levels, a secret island will then be unlocked, and you'll have a chance to see the game's true ending. There is definitely a lot of gameplay available if you want it, and the level design is certainly not repetitive, so this is a major positive for the game. As well as the white crystals, there are 5 coloured crystals per level. These are required to open a crystal door, which features a challenge to find the final Gobbo of each level. This is certainly the most difficult portion of each level, so those wanting to experience the true ending will need to work for it. The levels are split between smaller areas, which I refer to as puzzle rooms. No room is entirely straightforward. It appears the design goal is to feel a small sense of accomplishment for each one, and while this is sometimes true, it can be annoying if backtracking is required, especially since enemies you've already defeated will reappear. Boss fights are dispersed among the game too, although these were far too easy. It was always stupidly obvious what to do, but we must take into consideration that this sort of 3D gameplay was a brand new concept in 1997. Would players at the time find the solution so obvious? I have no idea, but there are a few that ended with no fanfare whatsoever. These were not the most satisfying victories I've ever experienced. I did enjoy the cutscenes introducing each boss however. Baron Dante creates them by finding everyday creatures like ladybugs and transforming them into larger, aggressive versions of themselves. The poor things always look baffled. There is a substantial difficulty spike halfway through the game. There is an increase in unforgiving platforming, swimming, and even those bloody monkey bars. It's here the camera really fails, another adverse trope of early 3D games. The wide open areas are fine, but the smaller the room, the more chance the camera will have of facing completely the wrong way, and there are a lot of enclosed areas. I always feel it's a bit unfair to criticize the cameras in these early games however. It was uncharted territory at the time, and it seems like a group effort from the game development community was required to get cameras to the high standard we enjoy today. At least, most of the time anyway. So, with that in mind, let's focus on some better parts of the gameplay. Many smaller aspects kept popping up that pleasantly surprised me. Raising Croc a step above your average corner shop platformer, even if it doesn't quite meet the grandeur of Crash or Spyro. I quite like the platforms you can hop on and control, and the crates that have a mind of their own that needed to be chased down was a fun twist I wasn't expecting. Even other random portions that crop up, like this balloon enemy that needs to be moved to a locked door and pumped up until it explodes, earned a smile. There are endless cool ideas like this spread throughout the game. The presentation for such an early PS1 game is top notch too. The environments are varied with decent texture work, while the enemies are cartoony and full of character. Croc himself is very likable also. Seemingly a bit of a goofball with one fang sticking out, apparently based on the artist's real life cat, he even sports a sensible backpack. You have to wonder what he keeps in there besides from crystals. Sort of like those people you see at music gigs jumping around the mosh pit while wearing one. What could they possibly be storing in there? Croc is voiced by Jonathan Arris, who is a British actor notable enough to have his own Wikipedia page. He apparently recorded all the lines in 1 hour, which would be impressive if it wasn't for the fact that Croc doesn't say much at all. He's featured in many TV shows and movies, but I know him as the narrator from Air Crash Investigation. Gosh, that show was traumatizing. Otherwise, the sound design is of similar quality to the graphics. There are some nice touches like the echoes in the water, and the soundtrack is also quite memorable. Reading reviews from the period, one of Croc's main criticisms was that the gameplay was derivative, like the crystal health system akin to Sonic. I don't find this entirely fair, because honestly, what game isn't? Especially since the idea of a 3D platformer was so new at the time. I feel like Croc is unjustly looked down upon in the present day. Games like Crash and Spyro instead have legendary status, but we must remember, Croc was considered a success at the time. It did sell 3 million copies after all. Sure, it doesn't hold a candle against Crash selling 6.8 million copies or even Spyro selling 5 million, but it was by no means a commercial failure. I would like to feel that the tide is changing, however. During the production of this video, there is hot news of a remaster in the works that should hopefully indicate that general sentiment is changing. Jez San, who founded Argonaut Software as a teenager in the 1980s and was the executive producer for Croc, retained the rights to the IP when his company went belly up in 2004. In the June of 2023, Jez made an offhand comment on Twitter that a Croc HD was in early development. It's exciting to think that Croc will finally be making a comeback on modern systems. Could this then facilitate a brand new Croc game sometime in the future? Here's hoping. Although it's not like this was the only Croc game ever to be released. Legend of the Gobbos was also released on PC, and the Sega Saturn, since that wasn't totally a lost cause by 1997. I would stick to the PC or PS1 versions however, since the PAL version on the Saturn was solved with a bug that caused some graphics to not render properly. Most notably, Croc's head. This is thankfully remedied by loading the disc after the console boots up, but meant extra instructions had to be included in the case. Otherwise, there were several Croc games released on Game Boy Color and mobile right up until 2006. 6 games were released in total, with one being Croc 2, also on the PlayStation. That was released in 1999 and apparently fixed many issues of the original. So, stay tuned, as this will be my next review where I discover where the series went next.